Daniel Brooks had it all figured out, millions in the bank, rules that kept his heart safe, and the confidence to declare in front of strangers that he'd never date outside his race. But when Emily Carter heard those words, she didn't get angry. She got curious. What this successful black millionaire didn't know was that one simple question from this quiet white woman would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, fear, and the walls we build around our hearts. Because sometimes the person who challenges your deepest beliefs is the same person destined to heal your oldest wounds. But when family pressure and past trauma threaten to destroy their connection, Daniel faces an impossible choice. Stick to the rules that have protected him for years, or risk everything for a love that could either complete him or destroy him. What happens next will shock you. If you're watching this story unfold, hit that subscribe button and tell me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. The soft jazz music drifted through the upscale lounge as Daniel Brooks adjusted his navy suit jacket. He stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the networking crowd mingle around him. The evening had been good for business. 3 new contacts, 2 potential deals, and one very clear reminder of why he kept his life organized the way he did. "So Daniel, you're still single?" asked Janet, a marketing consultant he'd met earlier. She smiled warmly, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "A successful man like you must have women lining up." Daniel chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "I'm focused on building my business right now. Besides, I'm pretty particular about who I date." "Oh, really?" Another voice joined the conversation. This was Mike, a real estate agent Daniel had done business with before. "What's your type then?" The group around them grew larger. Daniel noticed a few more people had moved closer, including a woman with light brown hair who was listening quietly near the edge of their circle. He didn't pay her much attention at first. "Well," Daniel said, feeling confident in the friendly crowd, "I keep things simple. I date black women. That's just how I am. No drama, no complications. I know what works for me." The words came out easily. He'd said them before to friends, to family, to himself. It was a rule that made sense. It kept his life clean, his choices clear. "That seems a bit," Janet started, looking uncomfortable. "What about love?" The quiet voice came from the woman with light brown hair. She stepped forward slightly, her green eyes meeting Daniel's directly. "What if you met someone amazing who didn't fit your rule?" Daniel turned to face her fully. She was pretty in a natural way. No heavy makeup, simple black dress, genuine smile. But her question caught him off guard. "I think you can find amazing people within the boundaries that work for you," he replied smoothly. "I'm not limiting myself. I'm just being smart about compatibility." The woman nodded slowly, still looking directly at him. "That's interesting. So you think love comes with instructions, like a recipe?" A few people in the group shifted uncomfortably. Daniel felt his confidence waver for just a moment, then strengthened his stance. "I think smart people learn from experience. They figure out what works and stick with it." The woman smiled, but it wasn't mean or angry. It was almost sad. "I suppose some people need rules to feel safe, even if those rules might keep them from something beautiful." She paused, then spoke her next words clearly so everyone could hear. "I hope someday you're brave enough to let your heart decide instead of your fear." The lounge seemed to go quiet around them. Daniel felt heat rise in his chest, but not anger. Something else. Something that made his pulse quicken in a way he didn't like. The woman gave him one more gentle look, nodded politely to the group, and walked away. Daniel watched her go, his whiskey glass suddenly feeling heavy in his hand. The conversation around him started up again, but he barely heard it. He kept thinking about her eyes, how she'd looked at him like she could see something he couldn't. "Well, that was interesting," Mike said, trying to lighten the mood. Daniel nodded absently, still watching the door where the woman had disappeared. For the first time in years, he felt unsettled. Not angry, not offended, just shaken. Emily Carter pushed through the lounge's heavy front door and stepped into the cool evening air. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. Her heart was beating faster than usual, but she felt strangely calm. "Em, there you are." Rachel Moore hurried over from where she'd been waiting by the parking area. "How was the networking thing?" Meet anyone interesting? Emily looked back at the lounge, then at her best friend. Rachel's dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore her favorite jeans and sweater. They'd known each other since college, and Rachel could read Emily's moods better than anyone. You could say that, Emily said quietly. Uh-oh. That tone means something happened. Good something or bad something? They started walking toward Emily's car, their footsteps echoing softly on the sidewalk. The street was quiet, with just a few other people scattered around the area. I'm not sure yet, Emily admitted. There was this man. Very confident, very successful looking. He was telling everyone about his dating rules. Rules? Rachel raised an eyebrow. What kind of rules? He said he only dates black women, like it was just a fact, a business decision. Rachel stopped walking. Seriously? And what did you do? Emily unlocked her car and leaned against it. I asked him about love, about what happens if you meet someone amazing who doesn't fit your categories. And? He basically said smart. People stick to what works. No risks, no complications. Rachel shook her head. Wow. And you said? Emily smiled softly, remembering the moment. I told him I hoped someday he'd be brave enough to let his heart decide instead of his fear. Oh my God, Em, you didn't. I did, right in front of everyone. Rachel stared at her friend. And how do you feel about it? Emily thought for a moment, watching a few cars pass by on the street. The evening was getting cooler, and she pulled her light jacket tighter around herself. I feel disappointed, I guess, not angry. Just sad for him. Disappointed, not offended. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was just scared. You could see it in his eyes when I challenged him. Like nobody had ever asked him to think about why he made that rule. Inside the lounge, Daniel stood near a window, watching the two women talk by Emily's car. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see Emily's calm gestures, her friend's animated responses. She didn't get mad, he said quietly. What? Marcus Reed, Daniel's closest friend, had just walked up with 2 fresh drinks. That woman, when I told her about my dating preferences, she didn't get angry or offended. She just looked disappointed. Marcus handed Daniel a drink and followed his gaze to the parking area. The blonde one? Light brown hair, green eyes. She basically told me I was letting fear make my decisions. And that bothers you because? Daniel turned away from the window. It doesn't bother me. She was wrong. But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't quite true. What bothered him was that she'd seemed genuinely concerned for him, not attacking him, not judging him, just wishing he could be different. Right, Marcus said, clearly not buying it. That's why you've been staring out that window for 10 minutes. Daniel looked at his friend. Marcus had been married to his wife Teresa for 5 years, and they were the happiest couple Daniel knew. Marcus was also the only person who could call Daniel out on his behavior without getting shut down. She made it sound like I was afraid of something. Aren't you? The question hung in the air between them. Daniel took a long sip of his drink, thinking about his answer. Outside, Emily was getting into her car. Rachel had already gotten into the passenger seat, still talking animatedly. Daniel watched as Emily paused before starting the engine, looking back at the lounge one more time. I'm being practical, Daniel finally said. There's a difference. But as Emily's car pulled away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, for the first time in years, practical wasn't enough. Daniel's downtown apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a successful 32-year-old businessman. Clean lines, expensive furniture, and a view of the city lights that had cost him extra. He'd worked hard for this space, this life, this control over his circumstances. But tonight, sitting on his leather couch with his laptop open, he couldn't concentrate on the quarterly reports that needed his attention. He kept thinking about her words. I hope someday you're brave enough to let your heart decide instead of your fear. Fear, that's what she'd called it. Daniel closed his laptop and walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows. The city looked busy and bright below him. All those people, all those lives, all those complications he'd learned to avoid. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. You good, man? You were pretty quiet after that woman left. Daniel typed back. Fine, just tired. But he wasn't tired. He was thinking, remembering. The rule about dating black women hadn't always existed. It had developed slowly, after a series of relationships that had left him feeling exposed and misunderstood. The last one, with a white woman named Stephanie, had ended particularly badly. She'd wanted him to be something he wasn't, less focused on work, more available for her social events, different somehow. When it ended, his mother had said, "Maybe you should stick with women who understand your world better." It had seemed like good advice at the time, practical advice, but tonight, that woman's calm voice kept echoing in his head. She hadn't seemed like someone who wanted to change him. She'd seemed like someone who wanted him to understand himself better. Daniel's phone rang. Marcus. "Couldn't sleep either," his friend said without preamble. "It's only 11. Teresa's making tea. She says you should come over and talk about whatever's bothering you." "Nothing's bothering me." "Right. That's why you spent the entire evening staring at a woman who called you out on your dating policy." Daniel sat back down on his couch. "She didn't call me out. She just had opinions. Opinions that got under your skin. Marcus, I've been successful in business because I make smart decisions based on experience. Dating is no different." "And what does your experience tell you about her?" Daniel paused. What did his experience tell him about Emily? That she was thoughtful, calm under pressure, not easily intimidated. That she'd challenged him without attacking him. That she'd looked at him like she could see something worth caring about, even while disagreeing with him. "It tells me she doesn't fit my usual patterns," he said quietly. "And that scares you." "It doesn't scare me. It just complicates things." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You know what Teresa told me when we first started dating? She said the best relationships aren't about finding someone who fits your plan. They're about finding someone worth changing your plan for." After they hung up, Daniel sat in his quiet apartment for a long time. He thought about rules and plans and the safety of knowing what to expect. But mostly, he thought about green eyes and a gentle voice that had seen right through him. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe his approach to dating really was just practical and smart. But as he finally headed to bed, Daniel had to admit something he hadn't admitted in years. Maybe she wasn't wrong at all. Emily's apartment was smaller than Daniel's, but it felt like home in a way his never quite did. Warm colors, plants by the windows, books scattered on the coffee table, and photos of family and friends covering the refrigerator door. She sat at her small kitchen table the next morning, sharing coffee with her father, Thomas Carter. He'd stopped by on his way to work, something he did a few times a month since Emily's mother had passed 2 years ago. "You're quiet this morning, honey," Thomas said, stirring cream into his coffee. "Everything okay?" Emily wrapped her hands around her warm mug and looked at her dad. At 61, he had gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was a high school principal, used to reading people and situations carefully. "I had an interesting conversation last night at that networking event." "Oh? Good interesting or challenging interesting?" Emily smiled. Her father always asked the right questions. "Challenging, I think. There was a man there who was very sure about his preferences in dating. He had rules." Thomas nodded, waiting for her to continue. "He said he only dates black women, made it sound like a business decision, very logical, very organized." "And how did that strike you?" Emily took a sip of her coffee, thinking. "It made me sad, I guess. Not angry, just sad. Like he was protecting himself from something that might actually be beautiful." "Did you tell him that?" "More or less. I asked him about love, about being brave enough to let his heart decide instead of his fear." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter's face. "That was bold of you." "Maybe too bold. Rachel thinks I might have been out of line." "What do you think?" Emily stared out her kitchen window at the small garden she'd planted in her backyard. Tomatoes, herbs, flowers, a mix of practical and beautiful, just like she tried to make her life. "I think he looked scared when I said it. Not angry, just scared. Like maybe nobody had ever asked him to think about why he needed those rules." Thomas nodded slowly. "You know, Emily, in my years as a principal, I've learned something about people who lead with rules instead of relationships. They're usually protecting something tender inside themselves." "That's what I thought too. But it still felt lonely, you know? All those walls he'd built around his heart." And that bothers you because? Emily looked at her father. This was his way, asking questions that helped her understand her own feelings better. Because I think he might be missing out on something real. And I think he knows it, deep down. Are you interested in him? The question surprised her. I don't know, maybe. There was something about him underneath all those rules, like he was more than he was letting himself be. Thomas reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. After what you went through with Kevin, I understand being careful about men with too much control over their world. Emily's last relationship had been with a man who'd wanted to manage every aspect of her life, where she worked, who she spent time with, how she dressed. It had taken her almost a year to feel like herself again after it ended. This felt different though, Dad. Kevin wanted to control me. This man seemed like he was trying to control himself, and maybe failing. That's a perceptive observation, honey. But remember, you can't fix someone who isn't ready to be fixed, and you shouldn't have to. Emily nodded. She knew her father was right. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. But as they finished their coffee and he got ready to leave for work, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the look in Daniel's eyes when she'd challenged him, like he'd wanted to argue with her but couldn't quite figure out how. Just be careful with your heart, Thomas said as he hugged her goodbye. It's generous and brave, but it's also been hurt before. After he left, Emily sat alone in her quiet kitchen, thinking about rules and fear and the difference between protecting yourself and limiting yourself. She didn't know if she'd ever see the man from the lounge again. But she hoped, if she did, that maybe he'd had some time to think too. Emily should have known the universe had a sense of humor. When her friend Lisa had asked her to help plan a surprise birthday party for Lisa's husband, Emily had said yes immediately. She loved organizing events, and Jake was a good guy who deserved a celebration. What she hadn't expected was to walk into Lisa's living room that afternoon and see the man from the lounge sitting on the couch, looking just as surprised to see her. Oh, Lisa said brightly, you two haven't met. Emily, this is Daniel Brooks. He works with Jake sometimes. Daniel, this is Emily Carter, my event planning genius. Emily and Daniel looked at each other for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. We've met, Emily said quietly. Sort of. Daniel stood up, straightening his casual button-down shirt. Today he looked less formal than he had at the networking event, but no less put together. At the networking mixer, he said. Nice to see you again, Emily. His voice was careful, polite. Emily wondered if he'd been thinking about their conversation as much as she had. Small world, she replied, keeping her own voice neutral. Lisa looked between them, clearly sensing some kind of history, but not sure what it was. Well, great. You already know each other. That'll make the planning easier. For the next hour, they sat around Lisa's coffee table going over party details, the guest list, the food, the decorations, the timeline. Emily took notes in her small notebook. Daniel offered practical suggestions about logistics, and they both worked hard to keep things professional. But Emily noticed things. The way Daniel listened carefully when she talked about creating a warm atmosphere for Jake's friends and family. How he offered to handle the more complicated arrangements without making it sound like she couldn't do it herself. How his suggestions were thoughtful, not controlling. I think we've got a good plan, Lisa said finally, looking at her list of assignments. Daniel, you're handling the sound system and the surprise timing with Jake. Emily, you've got decorations and food coordination. This is going to be perfect. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Daniel hesitated near the front door. Emily, could we talk for a minute? Lisa looked interested, but Emily gave her a look that clearly said, privacy, please. Lisa grinned and disappeared into the kitchen. Emily and Daniel stepped out onto the front porch. It was a warm afternoon, and Lisa's neighborhood was quiet except for a few kids playing in a yard down the street. I wanted to apologize, Daniel said, for the other night. If I came across as arrogant or dismissive. Emily studied his face. He seemed genuine, maybe even a little uncomfortable. You don't need to apologize for having opinions, she said, even if I disagree with them. Still, I got the feeling I might have said something that bothered you. Emily leaned against the porch railing, thinking about how to respond. She could be polite and surface level, or she could be honest. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. It's generous and brave, but it's also been hurt before. It didn't bother me, she said finally. It made me sad. Sad? For you. Because I think you're probably missing out on something beautiful, and I think part of you knows it. Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the tree-lined street. You don't know me well enough to make that judgment. You're right, I don't. But I know what I saw in your eyes when I said what I said. Which was? Emily met his gaze directly. Recognition, like you'd been waiting for someone to call you on it. Daniel felt that same unsettled feeling from the night before. This woman had a way of looking at him that made him feel exposed, but not in a bad way. More like she was seeing parts of him he'd forgotten were there. We should probably focus on Jake's party, he said, not because he wanted to change the subject, but because he wasn't sure he was ready for where this conversation might lead. Emily nodded, but she smiled a little. You're probably right. As they walked back toward their cars, Emily felt something she hadn't expected. Not attraction exactly, though Daniel was certainly handsome. More like curiosity. There were layers to this man that his rules and confidence couldn't quite cover up. And despite her father's warnings about being careful with her heart, Emily found herself wondering what those layers might reveal. Behind them, Lisa peeked out her kitchen window and smiled. She'd known Jake and Daniel for years, and she'd never seen Daniel look at anyone the way he'd been looking at Emily. Maybe this party would be more interesting than she'd planned. The group dinner had been Jake's idea. Since we're all working on this party thing together, he'd said, we might as well get to know each other better. Which was how Emily found herself sitting across from Daniel at a casual Italian restaurant, trying to focus on her chicken parmesan while being very aware of every word he spoke. The conversation flowed easily among the 6 people at the table, Jake and Lisa, another couple named Tom and Sarah, Emily and Daniel. They talked about work, travel, funny stories from college, favorite movies. Emily watched Daniel as he interacted with the group. He was confident without being arrogant, funny without trying too hard, and genuinely interested in what other people had to say. When Sarah talked about her job teaching elementary school, he asked thoughtful questions about her classroom challenges. When Tom mentioned his struggle to find work-life balance, Daniel offered practical advice without sounding preachy. This was different from the man at the networking event, more relaxed, more real. Emily, Lisa said, tell everyone about that wedding you planned last month. The one with the crazy mother of the bride. Emily laughed, launching into a story about a wedding where the bride's mother had changed the color scheme 3 times, fired 2 caterers, and tried to rewrite the ceremony the morning of the event. But it all worked out? Sarah asked. Beautiful wedding, perfect day. Sometimes chaos just needs the right person to organize it into something meaningful. Daniel found himself watching Emily as she told the story. Her hands moved as she talked, her eyes lit up when she described the bride's joy, and she made even the stressful part sound funny rather than bitter. You must have a lot of patience, he said. I think I just believe that most people want good things. They just don't always know how to get there by themselves. Something in the way she said it made Daniel wonder if she was talking about more than wedding planning. After dinner, the group stood outside the restaurant saying their goodbyes. The evening was warm, and nobody seemed in a hurry to leave. This was fun, Tom said. We should do it again after the party. Everyone agreed, making loose plans for the following month. As the others headed to their cars, Emily found herself walking slowly toward her parking spot with Daniel beside her. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not making tonight awkward after our conversation yesterday. Emily stopped next to her car and turned to face him. Why would I make it awkward? Some people might have, brought up what we talked about, made it a thing. I'm not really a make-it-a-thing person, Daniel smiled at that. No, I'm getting that impression about you. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. The parking lot was mostly empty, and the restaurant's outdoor lights cast a warm glow around them. Can I ask you something? Emily said. Sure. What you said at the networking event about dating rules, do you really believe that's the best way to find love? Like following a recipe? Daniel leaned against the car parked next to hers, thinking about his answer. A week ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. Tonight, with Emily looking at him with those calm, curious eyes, he wasn't so sure. I believe in learning from experience, he said carefully, making decisions that are likely to lead to good outcomes. But love isn't really about likely outcomes, is it? It's more about possibility, about being open to something unexpected. Unexpected can hurt you. So can expected. If you're expecting the wrong things. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. You really think I'm afraid? Emily considered her words carefully. I think you're careful. Maybe too careful. There's a difference between learning from the past and letting it control your future. And you think I'm doing the second thing. I think you're smart enough to know the difference, if you want to. As Emily got into her car and drove away, Daniel stood in the parking lot thinking about possibility and fear and the difference between being careful and being controlled. For the second time in 3 days, he felt unsettled in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Maybe that was something worth paying attention to. 2 days later, Daniel sat in his office conference room, trying to focus on the spreadsheet in front of him. But his mind kept wandering to Saturday evening and the way Emily had looked at him in that restaurant parking lot. Making decisions that are likely to lead to good outcomes, he'd said. It sounded reasonable when he said it, practical, smart, but her response kept echoing in his head. Love isn't really about likely outcomes, is it? His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. Planning meeting today at 3 p.m., Lisa's house, can you make it? Daniel checked his watch, 2:45 p.m. He could make it, but that meant seeing Emily again, talking through party details while trying not to think about the questions she'd raised about his entire approach to relationships. He grabbed his keys anyway. When he arrived at Lisa's house, Emily was already there, sitting on the living room floor with papers spread around her in organized piles. She wore jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked up when he walked in and smiled. Hi, Lisa's getting us some coffee. I was just going over the timeline for Saturday. Daniel sat down in the chair across from her makeshift workspace. How's it looking? Good, I think. The decorations will be ready by noon. The caterer confirmed delivery at now 2 p.m., and if you can get Jake there by 3:30, we should have everyone in place for the surprise. She handed him a neatly written schedule. As he read it, Daniel found himself impressed by her attention to detail. Every aspect of the party was planned, but not in a controlling way. More like she'd thought through all the possibilities and prepared for them. This is thorough, he said. I like things to go smoothly, but not perfectly. Perfect is boring. What's the difference? Emily looked up from the guest list she was reviewing. Smooth means everyone feels comfortable and happy. Perfect means everything goes exactly according to plan, even if the plan isn't actually working for people. Daniel thought about that. In his business, perfect and smooth usually meant the same thing. But maybe in relationships, they were different. Lisa came back with coffee and spent 20 minutes going over last-minute details. When she left to take a phone call from the cake decorator, Daniel found himself alone with Emily again. Can I ask you something? He said. Emily nodded, organizing papers as she listened. The other night you said love was about possibility, about being open to the unexpected. But don't you think some expectations are reasonable, like wanting someone who shares your values, your goals? Emily set down her pen and looked at him directly. Of course. I'm not talking about settling for someone who treats you badly or wants completely different things out of life. Then what are you talking about? I'm talking about the difference between standards and walls. Standards are about how someone treats you, how they live their life, what kind of person they are. Walls are about categories, rules that don't have anything to do with character. Daniel felt that familiar, unsettled feeling again. You think my dating preferences are walls, not standards. I think, Emily said carefully, that you're smart enough to know the difference between I want someone who respects me and I want someone who looks a certain way. One of those is about the person. The other is about protecting yourself from something. And you think I'm protecting myself from what, exactly? Emily was quiet for a moment, studying his face. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but direct. From having to trust someone who might not understand you automatically. From having to explain yourself, be vulnerable, risk being seen differently than you want to be seen. Daniel felt like she'd hit something right in the center of his chest. That's a lot of assumptions about someone you barely know. You're right. Maybe I'm wrong. But when you told me about learning from experience, what exactly did you learn? Before Daniel could answer, Lisa came back into the room, chattering about cake flavors and candle arrangements. The moment passed, but the question hung in the air between them. As they finished up the meeting and prepared to leave, Daniel realized something that surprised him. He'd been looking forward to seeing Emily today. Not just because she was attractive or interesting, but because talking to her made him think about things he usually avoided thinking about. That probably should have worried him more than it did. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about Emily's question. What exactly did you learn? At 2 a.m., he gave up on sleep and moved to his balcony with a cup of coffee. The city lights spread out below him, thousands of people living their complicated, messy, unpredictable lives. What had he learned from his past relationships? With Stephanie, he'd learned that dating someone from a different background could be exhausting. She'd wanted him to attend her family's country club events, where he felt like everyone was watching to see how he'd fit in. She'd made comments about his intensity when it came to work, like his ambition was something that needed to be managed rather than respected. When it ended, she'd said, "You never really let me in, Daniel. It's like you were always performing being someone you thought I wanted you to be." At the time, he'd thought she was being unfair. He'd been himself. He'd been successful, reliable, attentive. What more could she want? But now, sitting in the quiet darkness, he wondered if maybe she'd been right about one thing. Maybe he had been performing. Not because she'd asked him to, but because he'd been afraid of what might happen if he didn't. His phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. Marcus. "You're awake," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Couldn't sleep. What's your excuse?" "Teresa's having pregnancy cravings. I'm at the 24-hour grocery store buying ice cream and pickles, but I saw your lights on from the parking lot." Daniel smiled, despite his mood. Marcus lived in the building across the street. "How's she feeling?" "Good. Tired, but good. We told her parents yesterday." "That's great, man. Really?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You want to talk about whatever's keeping you up? Because I've got time while I wait for this ice cream to soften." Daniel looked out at the city lights, thinking about walls and standards and the difference between protection and limitation. "Do you think I'm afraid of getting hurt again?" "In relationships? Yeah, probably. Most people are after they've been hurt. But what if that fear is keeping me from, I don't know, something good? Like the woman from the party planning meeting?" Daniel wasn't surprised that Marcus had figured it out. "Emily. And I don't know if it's about her specifically or just the way she looks at things, the way she looks at me." "Which is how?" Daniel tried to put it into words. "Like she can see who I really am, underneath all the stuff I use to protect myself, and like that person is worth getting to know better." "And that scares you?" "Yeah, because what if she's wrong? What if the person underneath, all the protection isn't actually worth knowing?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Daniel could hear grocery store sounds in the background, shopping carts, checkout beepers, late-night conversations. "You know what Teresa told me when she was pregnant?" Marcus finally said. "She said the scariest part wasn't the labor or the responsibility. It was the idea that someone was going to love her so completely that all her walls would be useless." That doesn't sound very comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be true. Love isn't about staying safe, Daniel. It's about finding someone worth being unsafe with. After they hung up, Daniel sat on his balcony until the sun started to rise. He thought about safety and risk, about walls and possibilities, about the difference between learning from the past and being controlled by it. Mostly, though, he thought about green eyes and a gentle voice, asking him to be braver than he'd been willing to be. Maybe it was time to find out what that might look like. The coffee shop was busier than usual for a Thursday morning. Daniel had stopped in for his regular order, black coffee, no sugar, before heading to a client meeting. He was reading emails on his phone when he heard a familiar voice at the counter. "Medium coffee with cream. Do you have any of those blueberry muffins left?" He looked up to see Emily paying for her order. She wore dark jeans and a cream-colored cardigan, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked tired, like maybe she hadn't slept well either. Their eyes met across the crowded shop. Emily smiled and walked over to his table. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" she asked. "All the other tables are full." "Of course." Daniel closed his phone and moved his briefcase to make room. Emily sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "How's your morning going?" "Fine, busy. You look tired." "Thanks," Emily said with a laugh. "That's exactly what every woman wants to hear." Daniel felt heat rise in his face. I just meant you look like maybe you didn't sleep well." "I was awake most of the night, too." "Really? What kept you up?" Daniel looked at her across the small table. The coffee shop noise faded into the background. Conversations, espresso machines, morning news playing on the TV. He could give her a safe answer. Work stress, too much caffeine, neighbor's dog barking. Instead, he found himself being honest. "Thinking about what you asked yesterday, about what I learned from past relationships." Emily's expression softened. "And what did you figure out?" "That maybe I learned the wrong lessons, or the right lessons applied in the wrong way." "What do you mean?" Daniel took a sip of his coffee, buying himself time to think. "I learned that dating someone from a different background can be complicated. But maybe I decided that meant I should avoid complications entirely, instead of learning how to handle them better." Emily nodded slowly. "That makes sense. Complications can be worth it if the person is worth it. How do you know if they're worth it?" "I guess you don't. Not at first. That's what makes it scary." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Daniel watched Emily break her muffin into small pieces, eating them slowly while she stared out the coffee shop window. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "Why do you care?" "About my dating rules, I mean. We barely know each other." Emily looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because I think you're better than your rules. And I think you know it. That's a lot of faith to put in a stranger." "Maybe, but I don't think you're really a stranger. I think you're someone who's forgotten what it feels like to take a chance on something real." Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not uncomfortable this time, but open. Like a door he'd kept locked was slowly being opened. What if taking chances just leads to getting hurt again? Then you get hurt, and then you heal, and then you decide if it was worth it. "You make it sound simple," Emily smiled, but there was something sad in her eyes. "It's not simple. It's terrifying. But the alternative is staying locked up in rules and walls until you forget why you built them in the first place." "Sounds like you know something about that." "I do. My last relationship. Let's just say I learned what it feels like when someone tries to control your whole life. For a while after it ended, I had my own walls, my own rules about who was safe and who wasn't." "What changed your mind?" "My dad. He told me there's a difference between being careful and being closed off. Careful protects you from real danger. Closed off protects you from everything, including good things." Daniel studied her face as she talked. There was something in her expression, a kind of quiet strength that came from having been hurt and choosing to stay open anyway. "That must have been hard," he said quietly. "It was, but staying closed off was harder, lonelier." Emily's phone buzzed with a text. She checked it and sighed. "I need to get going. Client meeting in 20 minutes. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The desire to know more about someone, to understand how they saw the world, to be understood in return. "Emily," he said as they reached the coffee shop door. "Yeah?" "Thank you for the conversation, for pushing back on my assumptions. Thank you for listening. That's rarer than you might think." As Emily walked away toward her car, Daniel stood on the sidewalk watching her go. For the first time in years, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something that could change everything. The question was whether he was brave enough to step forward. Emily sat in her car after her client meeting, staring at her phone without really seeing it. The meeting had gone well, a young couple planning their first anniversary party, but she couldn't concentrate on the details. She kept thinking about Daniel's face in the coffee shop that morning, the way he'd looked when he said maybe he'd learned the wrong lessons, like he was seeing himself clearly for the first time in a while. There was something about him that drew her in, despite all her careful instincts about self-protection. He was complicated in a way that felt challenging rather than dangerous, like a puzzle she wanted to understand, not a problem she needed to fix. But Emily had learned to be wary of that feeling. Her relationship with Kevin had started the same way, with her thinking she could help him become his better self. The difference was that Kevin had wanted to be controlled, had expected her to make decisions for both of them, and then resented her for it. Daniel seemed like the opposite, like he'd been controlling himself for so long that he'd forgotten how to let anyone else in. Her phone rang. Rachel. "Hey, busy day?" Rachel asked. "Pretty busy. Just finished with the Mitchell anniversary party consultation." "How's the other project going, the birthday party thing?" Emily knew Rachel was really asking about Daniel. "Fine. We have everything organized for Saturday." "And the guy? The one with the dating rules?" Emily pulled into a parking space outside her apartment building and turned off the car. "His name is Daniel, and I don't know. Maybe I was wrong about him." "Wrong how?" "Maybe he's not ready to question his rules. Maybe I pushed too hard." Rachel was quiet for a moment. You know I love you, but you have a tendency to take on other people's emotional growth as your personal project." "I know, I'm trying not to do that. But I think he's asking himself real questions about why he built those walls, whether they're still serving him. And I think that's scary for him. And you want to help him through it." Emily sighed, leaning her head back against the car seat. "I want to know what's underneath all that protection. I think it might be something pretty amazing. Just be careful, okay? You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and you shouldn't have to convince anyone to take a chance on you." After they hung up, Emily sat in her car thinking about chance and choice and the difference between helping someone grow and trying to change them. Rachel was right about her pattern. She did tend to see potential in people and want to help them reach it. But with Daniel, it felt different. Less like she wanted to fix him and more like she wanted to understand him. The question was whether understanding would be enough, or if she was setting herself up to want more than he was ready to give. Saturday afternoon, Jake's surprise party was in full swing. The backyard was filled with friends and family, the food was perfect, and Jake had been genuinely shocked and delighted when 30 people jumped out yelling, "Surprise!" Emily moved through the party, making sure everything was running smoothly, refilling food trays, introducing people who didn't know each other, helping with the music when the speaker system got temperamental. She was carrying a fresh pitcher of lemonade from the kitchen when she noticed Daniel standing by himself near the back fence, watching the crowd with a thoughtful expression. "Taking a break from the party?" she asked, walking over to join him. Daniel smiled. "Just observing. You did an incredible job with this. Jake looks happier than I've ever seen him." Emily followed his gaze to where Jake was surrounded by friends, laughing at something his brother was saying. "He's easy to plan for. He just wants everyone to have a good time." "Is that what you want too? For everyone to have a good time?" Emily considered the question. "I want people to feel cared for, like someone thought about what would make them happy and took the time to make it happen." "That's a nice way to look at the world." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the party flow around them. Kids ran between the adults' conversations, couples shared quiet moments on the porch, and Lisa moved through the crowd taking pictures of everything. "Can I tell you something?" Daniel said. Emily nodded. "I've been thinking about our conversation in the coffee shop, about learning the wrong lessons. And," Daniel turned to face her more directly, "I think I've been so focused on avoiding getting hurt that I forgot about everything else, about connection, about growth, about possibility." Emily felt something warm spread through her chest, but she kept her voice careful. "That's a big realization." "It is. And it's scary as hell." "Change usually is." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know how to do this differently. I've been protecting myself for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to be open to someone." Emily's heart went out to him. This was what courage looked like, admitting you didn't know how to do something that mattered. "Maybe you start small," she said gently. "Maybe you start by admitting that your rules might not be serving you anymore. And then what? And then you see what happens when you let someone pass them." Before Daniel could respond, Lisa appeared beside them with her camera. "Perfect. I need a picture of my party planning team." She gestured for them to stand closer together. "This party couldn't have happened without you two. Emily and Daniel moved closer, Daniel's hand settling lightly on Emily's back as Lisa snapped several photos. Emily was aware of his warmth, his height, the way he smelled like cedar and something clean. "Beautiful," Lisa said, checking the photos on her camera. "You two make a great team." As Lisa hurried away to photograph other guests, Emily and Daniel found themselves standing closer than they had before. Emily could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the tension in his careful posture. "Emily," he said quietly. "Yeah? Would you like to have dinner with me sometime? Not for party planning, just to talk." Emily felt her pulse quicken. This was what she'd been hoping for, but now that it was happening, she felt her own protective instincts kicking in. "Are you sure that's what you want?" she asked. "Because I'm not interested in being someone's experiment in dating outside their comfort zone." Daniel's expression grew serious. "That's not what this would be." "Then what would it be?" "It would be me taking a chance on something that feels important, even though it scares me." Emily studied his face, looking for any sign that he was saying what he thought she wanted to hear, but his eyes were steady, honest. "Okay," she said simply. Daniel smiled, and Emily realized it was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "Really?" "Really. But Daniel?" "Yeah? If we do this, we do it honestly. No rules about who we're supposed to be or how this is supposed to work. Just us figuring it out as we go." "That sounds terrifying and perfect," Daniel said. As they exchanged phone numbers and made loose plans for the following week, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just attraction or curiosity, but hope. Maybe Rachel was right to worry about her tendency to see potential in people, but maybe sometimes the potential was real, and maybe sometimes it was worth the risk to find out. The party continued around them, full of laughter and music and the comfortable chaos of people who cared about each other. Emily and Daniel stayed by the back fence, talking about everything except the fact that they were both terrified and excited about what might happen next. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And for the first time since Kevin, Emily felt like taking a chance might actually lead somewhere beautiful. 1 week after Jake's party, Daniel stood outside the small Italian restaurant where he and Emily had agreed to meet for dinner. He'd arrived 10 minutes early and spent most of that time questioning whether this was a good idea. Not because he didn't want to be there, he did, more than he'd wanted anything in a long time, but because wanting something this much felt dangerous in a way he'd forgotten how to handle. Emily appeared at the end of the block, walking toward him with a smile that made his chest feel tight. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a light jacket over her arm. Nothing fancy, but she looked beautiful in a way that seemed effortless. "Sorry I'm a little late," she said as she reached him. "Last-minute call from a client." "No problem. I just got here myself." They went inside and were seated at a small table near the window. The restaurant was cozy, not too loud, with soft lighting that made everything feel intimate without being overwhelming. "This is nice," Emily said, looking around. "How did you find it?" "Marcus recommended it. He and Teresa come here for date nights." "How's Teresa doing, with the pregnancy?" Daniel smiled. "Good. Tired but excited. Marcus is completely freaking out about becoming a dad, but in a good way." "That's sweet. Are you close to them?" "Marcus has been my best friend since college. Teresa, she's like the sister I never had. They're good people." Emily nodded, studying his face as he talked. "You light up when you talk about them." "They're the closest thing I have to family here. My mom's back in Atlanta, and my dad—" Daniel paused, then decided to be honest. "My dad wasn't really around when I was growing up, so Marcus and Teresa, they're my chosen family." "That must mean a lot to them, too. Knowing they matter to you that much." Daniel looked at her across the small table. "You're easy to talk to, you know that." "Is that surprising?" "A little. I'm usually more careful about what I share with people." "Why?" Daniel took a sip of his wine, thinking about how to answer. "Because sharing things makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability can be used against you. By the wrong people, sure, but it can also bring you closer to the right people." "How do you know which is which?" Emily smiled softly. "You pay attention. You listen to how they respond when you tell them something real. Do they judge you, try to fix you, or use it to make themselves feel better? Or do they just listen and accept it as part of who you are? Daniel thought about that as their dinner arrived. They talked about work, travel, books they'd read recently. Emily told him about growing up in a small town outside the city, about her mother's death, and how it had brought her and her father closer together. Daniel found herself sharing stories about building his business, about the satisfaction of creating something successful from nothing. "What made you want to start your own company?" Emily asked. "Control, honestly. I got tired of having my future depend on other people's decisions. I wanted to build something that was mine." "That makes sense. But don't you get lonely being in charge of everything?" Daniel paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Sometimes, but it's safer than depending on people who might let you down, or might surprise you in good ways. That's a risk I haven't been willing to take." "Until now?" Daniel looked at her directly. "Maybe until now." After dinner, they walked slowly back toward their cars, neither seeming in a hurry to end the evening. The night was warm, and the downtown area was busy with other couples and groups of friends enjoying their Saturday night. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said as they paused at the corner. "Sure. What changed your mind? About taking risks, I mean. A week ago you seemed pretty convinced that your approach was working for you." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the traffic light change from red to green and back again. "You did," he said finally. "The way you looked at me that first night, like you could see something I couldn't see. And then the way you kept challenging me, but gently. Like you believed I could be better than I was being. I don't want to change you, Daniel." "I know. That's what made me trust what you were saying. You weren't trying to make me into someone else. You were trying to help me remember who I actually am, underneath all the rules I've built up." They reached Emily's car, but neither moved to say goodbye. "So what happens now?" Emily asked. "Now I figure out how to be the person you saw when you looked at me, even though it scares me." Emily stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," she said softly. "You just have to be willing to try." Daniel reached up and touched her face gently. "What if I mess this up? Then we'll figure it out together." When Daniel kissed her, it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. The next 2 weeks felt like a different life entirely. Daniel found himself texting Emily good morning messages before he'd even had his coffee. He looked forward to their evening phone calls more than his business meetings. When she mentioned loving old movies, he suggested they spend Saturday afternoon at the Revival Theater downtown. "I can't believe you've never seen Casablanca," Emily said as they walked out of the theater, blinking in the bright afternoon sunlight. "I'm more of an action movie guy usually." "And what did you think?" Daniel considered. "I liked it more than I expected to. All that stuff about sacrifice and doing the right thing even when it hurts. The romantic stuff didn't get to you at all?" Daniel smiled, taking her hand as they walked toward his car. "Maybe a little. The part where he realizes she's worth changing his whole life for." Emily squeezed his hand. "That's my favorite part, too." They spent the evening at Daniel's apartment, cooking dinner together and talking about everything and nothing. Emily was impressed by his kitchen, well-equipped but clearly not used much for anything elaborate. "You really don't cook much, do you?" she said, watching him struggle to find a can opener. "I eat out a lot, or order in. Teresa keeps threatening to teach me, but I never seem to find the time." "It's not that hard. Here, let me show you." Emily moved to stand beside him at the counter, guiding his hands as they chopped vegetables for a simple pasta sauce. Daniel found himself more focused on her closeness than the cooking instructions. "Are you paying attention?" she asked, looking up at him with amusement. "Not really," Daniel admitted. "I'm a little distracted." "By what?" Instead of answering, Daniel kissed her. Soft at first, then deeper when she kissed him back. When they finally separated, Emily's cheeks were flushed and Daniel felt like he could barely think straight. "The sauce is going to burn," Emily said quietly. "I don't care about the sauce," Emily laughed, reaching around him to turn down the burner. "Well, I do. I'm hungry." They managed to finish cooking dinner, though it took longer than it should have with all the kissing and conversation interruptions. Afterward, they settled on Daniel's couch with glasses of wine, Emily curled up against his side. "This is nice," she said, her head on his shoulder. "Better than nice," Daniel replied, playing with her hair. "I can't remember the last time I felt this, content. Content is good. Content is underrated. Is this what you want? Content?" Emily lifted her head to look at him. "Right now? Yes. But eventually, I want more than content. I want partnership. I want someone who chooses me every day, not just when it's easy." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. That sounds scary. It is scary. That's what makes it worth it. Later, as Emily was getting ready to leave, Daniel found himself not wanting her to go. "Stay," he said quietly. Emily paused in putting on her jacket. "Daniel, not for... I just mean stay. Sleep here. Wake up with me tomorrow." Emily studied his face. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She stayed. And when Daniel woke up the next morning with Emily sleeping peacefully beside him, sunlight filtering through his bedroom curtains, he felt something he'd never felt before. Complete. Like all the pieces of his life had finally fallen into place. "You look happy," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from Daniel's desk with his coffee. It was Monday afternoon, and Daniel had spent most of the morning distracted, thinking about the weekend with Emily instead of focusing on the quarterly reports he was supposed to be reviewing. "I feel happy," Daniel admitted. "Different. Good. Different. Things are going well with Emily?" "Really well. Better than I expected. Better than I thought I deserved." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting way to put it." Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the busy street below. "You know how I've always been careful about relationships? About not getting too involved too quickly? Your famous dating rules, you mean?" "Yeah, well, with Emily, all of that just doesn't seem to matter anymore. Like the rules were keeping me from something I didn't even know I wanted. And that feels good?" "It feels terrifying and amazing at the same time." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying his friend's face. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. What happens if it doesn't work out? If things get complicated or difficult?" Daniel felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. "I try not to think about that. But you should think about it. Not to plan for failure, but to know that you can handle it if things don't go perfectly." "Why are you asking me this?" Marcus set down his coffee and looked directly at Daniel. "Because I've never seen you this invested in anyone before, and I want to make sure you're ready for what that means." "What does it mean?" "It means you can't control how this turns out. You can't make rules that guarantee Emily will never hurt you or leave you or disappoint you. You just have to trust that she won't." Daniel felt his chest tighten. That's a lot of trust to put in someone. It is. But that's what love is, man. It's choosing to be vulnerable with someone and hoping they'll be careful with that vulnerability. After Marcus left, Daniel sat alone in his office thinking about trust and vulnerability and the difference between being careful and being scared. He'd been telling himself that his feelings for Emily were about her specifically, her kindness, her intelligence, the way she challenged him to be better. But maybe they were also about him finally being ready to take the kind of risk he'd been avoiding his whole adult life. The question was whether he was strong enough to handle it if that risk didn't pay off. That evening, Daniel drove to his mother's house for their monthly dinner. Linda Brooks lived in a quiet suburb about 30 minutes from downtown, in the same house where Daniel had spent his teenage years after his parents' divorce. "You look good, baby," she said, hugging him at the front door. "Rested. Happy." "Thanks, Mom. How are you feeling?" Linda was 58, retired from her job as a school administrator, and spent most of her time volunteering at her church and spoiling Marcus and Teresa's dog when they traveled. "I'm fine, but I want to hear about this woman Marcus tells me you've been seeing." Daniel should have known Marcus would mention Emily. "Her name is Emily. She's really special, Mom." They settled in the living room with glasses of sweet tea while dinner finished cooking in the kitchen. Linda studied her son's face with the careful attention of someone who'd raised him alone for most of his life. "Special how?" "She's kind, thoughtful. She sees the best in people, even when they don't see it in themselves." "That sounds wonderful. What does she do?" "She's an event planner. Freelance. She's incredibly organized, but not in a controlling way. More like she just wants everyone to be happy and comfortable. Linda nodded slowly. And how do you feel about her? Daniel was quiet for a moment, trying to put his feelings into words. Like I've been holding my breath for years and I can finally exhale. That's beautiful, Daniel. I'm happy for you. But, Linda smiled at how well her son knew her. But I worry about you getting too invested too quickly. You've always been someone who keeps his heart protected, and for good reason. I just want to make sure you're not opening yourself up to being hurt again. Daniel thought about his last serious relationship with Stephanie. How his mother had been the one to suggest he might be happier with someone who understood his world better. How her advice had led to the dating rules that had shaped his romantic life for the past 3 years. What if the protection was also keeping me from something good, he asked. Then that's a risk you have to decide if you're willing to take. But Daniel, honey, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Okay. Is she white? Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Does that matter? It matters because the last time you dated a white woman, you got hurt. Badly. And I'm worried you might be repeating that pattern. Emily isn't Stephanie, Mom. I know that, but you're still the same man who came home heartbroken 3 years ago, talking about how you never wanted to feel that vulnerable again. Daniel set down his sweet tea and looked at his mother directly. What are you really worried about? Linda was quiet for a long moment. I'm worried you're going to let your guard down completely, and when things get difficult, and they will get difficult, you won't be prepared for it. I'm worried you're going to get hurt again, and this time it might be worse because you're letting yourself feel more. So you think I should end it? Before it gets too serious? I think you should be careful. I think you should remember that love isn't always enough to overcome fundamental differences between people. That night, Daniel lay awake in bed thinking about his mother's words, about protection and risk, about patterns and possibilities, about the difference between being careful and being afraid. Emily had challenged him to be braver than his rules. But what if his rules existed for good reasons? What if the very thing that made Emily special, her ability to see past his defenses, was also what made her dangerous? For the first time since he'd started dating Emily, Daniel felt doubt creeping in. Not about her, but about himself, about whether he was strong enough to handle the kind of love she seemed to be offering, and about whether he was setting them both up for heartbreak by trying to be someone he might not actually be ready to become. Emily sensed the change in Daniel immediately. It was subtle at first, slightly shorter phone calls, a day or two between text messages instead of constant communication, a certain distraction when they were together. But Emily had learned to pay attention to the spaces between words, the things people didn't say as much as the things they did. Everything okay? She asked Thursday evening as they walked through the park near her apartment. Yeah, of course. Why? You seem a little distant tonight. Distracted. Daniel was quiet for a moment. They'd stopped beside a small pond where ducks were swimming in lazy circles, and Emily watched him watching them, his expression thoughtful and troubled. I had dinner with my mom earlier this week, he said finally. How is she? Good. Fine. She had some concerns about us. Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. What kind of concerns? Daniel turned to look at her, and Emily saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. Fear. She's worried I'm moving too fast, getting too invested too quickly. And what do you think? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I think maybe she's right. The words hit Emily like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were careful, measured, like Daniel was already pulling away, already protecting himself. I see, she said quietly. Emily, it's not that I don't care about you, I do, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe I'm not ready for this kind of intensity. Emily felt tears prick at her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. What are you saying, Daniel? I'm saying maybe we should slow down, take some space, figure out if this is real or if we're just caught up in the excitement of something new. Emily stared at him, seeing not the man who had held her while she slept 3 nights ago, but the guarded, rule-following man she'd met at the networking event, The man who chose safety over possibility every time. "You're scared," she said quietly. "Yes, I'm scared. And maybe that's smart. Maybe being scared is what keeps people from making mistakes that hurt everyone involved." Emily nodded slowly, feeling something break inside her chest. Not anger, but disappointment so deep it felt like grief. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Okay. If that's what you want, then okay. I'm not going to try to convince you to feel differently than you feel." Daniel looked surprised, like he'd expected her to fight or argue or try to change his mind. "Really? Really? You know what you can handle and what you can't. I respect that." They walked back to their cars in silence, the comfortable intimacy of the past few weeks replaced by polite distance. When they reached Emily's car, Daniel hesitated. "Emily, you don't have to explain," she said gently. "You don't owe me anything more than honesty. And you've been honest." "I don't want to hurt you," Emily smiled sadly. "I know. But Daniel, sometimes the things we do to avoid hurting people end up hurting them anyway." As Emily drove away, Daniel stood in the parking lot feeling like he'd just made the smartest and stupidest decision of his life at the same time. He'd protected himself, kept his heart safe, made the practical choice. So why did it feel like he'd just thrown away the best thing that had ever happened to him? Emily made it home before she started crying. She sat in her car in her driveway for 10 minutes, letting the tears come while she stared at her small house with its cheerful porch light and the garden she'd planted in the spring. She'd known this might happen, had felt it in the careful way Daniel had started choosing his words, the way he'd begun pulling back even while they were together. But knowing something was possible and experiencing it were two very different things. When she finally went inside, she called Rachel. "What happened?" Rachel said immediately. "You sound terrible." Daniel ended it, sort of. He wants space to figure out if what we have is real. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry." Emily curled up on her couch with a cup of tea, her phone on speaker, while Rachel listened to the whole story. "I just don't understand," Emily said finally. 3 days ago he was telling me I made him feel complete. Tonight he's saying maybe his mother is right and he's moving too fast." "What exactly did his mother say?" "That he should be careful. That love isn't always enough to overcome fundamental differences. That he got hurt before and might not be prepared for it to happen again." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Emily, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you more hurt that he ended it, or hurt that he chose fear over courage?" Emily thought about that. "Both, I think. But mostly, I'm disappointed. I really thought he was ready to be braver than his rules. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he still isn't. I know. And I can't make someone ready for something they're not ready for. I learned that lesson with Kevin. This is different from Kevin, though." "How?" "Kevin wanted you to make all the decisions for both of you and then resented you for it. Daniel wants to make his own decisions, even if they're the wrong ones. That's actually healthier, even if it doesn't feel better right now." After they hung up, Emily sat alone in her quiet living room, thinking about courage and fear and the difference between protecting yourself and limiting yourself. She'd known dating Daniel was a risk, had known he might not be ready for the kind of connection they'd started to build, but she'd taken the chance anyway because she'd believed in what she saw underneath his careful rules. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe the man she'd seen glimpses of wasn't ready to exist outside of stolen moments and private conversations. Or maybe he was just too scared to find out. Either way, Emily knew she'd done the right thing by not trying to convince him to stay. Love couldn't be talked into or reasoned through. It had to be chosen, freely and bravely, by both people. And if Daniel wasn't ready to choose it, then she had to let him go. Even if letting go felt like losing something she'd been waiting her whole life to find. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling like he'd made a terrible mistake. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the look in Emily's eyes when he'd told her they should take a break. Not anger, not hurt, but disappointment. Like she'd expected better from him and he'd let her down. Maybe he had. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Coffee? I'm buying." Daniel knew that tone. Marcus wanted to talk, and it probably wasn't going to be comfortable. They met at the coffee shop where Daniel had run into Emily weeks ago. The same table where she'd asked him what he'd learned from his past relationships, where he'd started to question whether his rules were protection or limitation. "You look terrible," Marcus said, settling into his chair with 2 cups of coffee. "Thanks, that's helpful." "What happened with Emily?" Daniel took a long sip of his coffee, buying time. "We decided to take a break, figure out if what we have is real or just new relationship excitement." "We decided? Or you decided?" Daniel looked at his friend. Marcus knew him too well to accept careful explanations. "I decided, after talking to my mom." "Ah," Marcus leaned back in his chair. "And what did your mom say?" "That I should be careful, that love isn't always enough, that I might be repeating old patterns." "And you believed her?" "She's not wrong, Marcus. The last time I let myself get this invested in someone, it ended badly. Really badly." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying Daniel's face. "Can I tell you something? Do I have a choice?" "Not really. 3 years ago, when things ended with Stephanie, you came to me heartbroken and angry. You said you never wanted to feel that vulnerable again, and I understood that. Getting hurt like that changes you." Daniel nodded. He remembered that conversation clearly. "But here's what I didn't tell you then, because you weren't ready to hear it. The problem with Stephanie wasn't that she was white. It wasn't even that you two came from different backgrounds. The problem was that she wanted you to be someone you weren't, and you tried to be that person instead of being yourself. Emily's different. I know she is. That's my point. Emily sees who you actually are and likes that person. She's not trying to change you into someone more convenient for her. She's challenging you to be more yourself, not less." Daniel felt something tight in his chest. "What if I'm not ready for that kind of relationship?" "Then you're not, and that's okay. But don't make this about Emily being white or your mother's concerns about patterns. Make it about the truth, that you're scared of being hurt again, and you don't think love is worth that risk." "And if that's the truth?" Marcus looked at him directly. "Then you let her go, and you accept that you chose safety over happiness. But you don't lie to yourself about why." After Marcus left, Daniel sat alone in the coffee shop, thinking about truth and fear, and the difference between learning from the past and being controlled by it. His mother's concerns weren't wrong. Love wasn't always enough to overcome differences. People did get hurt when they opened themselves up to vulnerability. But maybe Marcus was right too. Maybe the real question wasn't whether he might get hurt. Maybe it was whether Emily was worth the risk of getting hurt. And as he sat there remembering the way she'd looked at him with such gentle disappointment, Daniel realized he already knew the answer to that question. The harder question was whether he was brave enough to act on it. Daniel spent the rest of that week in a fog of regret and second-guessing. At work, he stared at spreadsheets without seeing the numbers. He canceled 2 client meetings because he couldn't focus on anything beyond the look in Emily's eyes when he'd chosen fear over courage. He kept picking up his phone to text her, then putting it down again. What could he say? "Sorry, I panicked when I realized I was falling in love with you. I made a mistake because my mother reminded me of an old heartbreak. I threw away the best thing in my life because being vulnerable terrifies me." All of those things were true, but none of them seemed like enough. On Friday evening, he sat alone in his apartment, eating takeout Chinese food and staring out at the city lights. The same view that had always made him feel successful and in control now just felt empty. His phone rang. His mother. "Hi, baby," Linda said. "How was your week?" "Fine," Daniel lied. "Busy." "Good. I've been thinking about our conversation, about that girl you were seeing." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "Emily." "Emily, yes. I hope you know I wasn't trying to interfere in your life. I just worry about you." "I know, Mom." Did you talk to her about taking things slower?" Daniel closed his eyes, remembering Emily's calm acceptance, her refusal to fight for something he wasn't ready to give. "We're taking a break," he said. "Oh, well, that's probably smart. Give yourself time to think clearly." But Daniel wasn't thinking clearly. He was thinking about Emily's laugh when she tried to teach him to cook, about the way she'd looked at him in the movie theater, like he was someone worth knowing, about how complete he'd felt waking up next to her, like all the scattered pieces of his life had finally found their place. "Mom," he he said quietly. Yes? What if the break isn't smart? What if it's just scared? Linda was quiet for a long moment. Baby, what are you really asking me? Daniel looked out at the city lights, thinking about courage and fear, and the difference between wisdom and cowardice. I'm asking if you think it's possible to love someone enough to be brave for them, even if being brave means you might get hurt. Daniel, because I think I do. Love her enough, I mean. And I think I threw it away because I was too scared to find out what that might look like. His mother sighed softly. Honey, I can't answer that for you. But I will say this. I raised you to be a man who faces hard things, not one who runs from them. If you think you made a mistake, then maybe you should figure out how to fix it. After they hung up, Daniel sat in his quiet apartment thinking about the difference between protecting yourself and limiting yourself, about learning from the past without being controlled by it. Emily had seen something in him that first night, not just the successful businessman with careful rules, but the man underneath who was worth taking a chance on. She'd challenged him to be braver than his fear, more honest than his defenses. And when he'd finally started to be that man, when he'd felt what it was like to love someone completely and be loved in return, he'd let old wounds and other people's worries convince him to step back into his safe, small world. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe this wasn't about Emily being white or his mother's concerns about patterns. Maybe this was about him choosing fear over love, safety over growth, rules over his own heart. The question was whether it was too late to choose differently. That same Friday evening, Emily sat in her father's kitchen, helping him prepare dinner for the two of them. It had become a weekly tradition since her mother's death, a way to make sure they both ate something besides takeout and stayed connected despite their busy lives. You're quiet tonight, honey, Thomas said, stirring the pasta sauce he'd been working on for the past hour. Everything okay? Emily looked up from the salad she was making. Just thinking about some things. Want to talk about them? Emily set down her knife and looked at her father. Thomas Carter had always been someone she could talk to about anything. Patient, thoughtful, never quick to judge or offer easy answers. Do you remember that man I told you about? Daniel? The one with the dating rules? Thomas nodded. The one you challenged to be braver than his fear. That's him. We were dating for a few weeks. It was really good, Dad, like surprisingly good. He was different than I expected. Kinder, more thoughtful, less sure of himself than he pretended to be. That sounds promising. What happened? Emily sank into one of the kitchen chairs, suddenly feeling tired. He got scared. His mother reminded him that he'd been hurt before by a white woman, and he decided maybe we were moving too fast. Maybe it wasn't real. Thomas turned from the stove to look at his daughter directly. And how do you feel about that? Disappointed. Not angry, just sad for both of us. Because I think he knows he made a mistake, but he's too scared to admit it. Do you think he loves you? The question surprised Emily. She'd been trying not to think about love, had been telling herself they'd only been dating a few weeks, that it was too soon for such big feelings. I think he might, she said quietly. I think that's what scared him. Thomas nodded slowly, the way he did when he was thinking through something complicated. You know, Emily, when your mother and I first started dating, I was terrified of her. Terrified? Why? Because she was everything I'd been afraid to want. Smart, beautiful, strong-willed. She saw right through all my careful plans and polite manners to who I really was underneath. And she liked that person better than the version I thought I was supposed to be. Emily smiled softly. She'd heard stories about her parents' courtship, but never quite like this. What did you do? I ran, Thomas admitted, for about 3 months. Told myself she was too complicated, too intense, that we wanted different things out of life. But you came back? She came after me, actually. Showed up at my apartment one evening and told me I was being an idiot. Said if I wanted to waste my life being scared of good things, that was my choice. But she wasn't going to let me waste hers by pretending I didn't care about her when we both knew I did. Emily laughed despite herself. That sounds like Mom. It does. But here's the thing, honey. I had to be ready to hear what she was saying. She couldn't make me brave. She could only challenge me to be braver than I was being. And if Daniel isn't ready to be challenged? Thomas came over and sat down across from his daughter. Then he isn't. And that's not your fault or your responsibility. You can't love someone into courage, Emily. They have to choose it for themselves. So what do I do? Just wait and hope he figures it out? You live your life. You don't put your happiness on hold for someone else's fear. And if he does figure it out, if he does choose to be brave, then you decide if it's worth trying again. And if he doesn't, then you'll be okay. Because you're strong and kind and worthy of love from someone who isn't too scared to give it freely. After dinner, Emily drove home thinking about courage and choice, and the difference between fighting for someone and waiting for them to fight for themselves. She missed Daniel, missed their conversations, their easy laughter, the way he'd looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the world. But she also knew her father was right. She couldn't make Daniel ready for love. She could only be ready herself whenever love came to find her again. Saturday morning, Daniel woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt all week. He'd spent Friday night thinking about Emily's words from that first networking event. I hope someday you're brave enough to let your heart decide instead of your fear. She'd been right then, and she was still right now. He'd been letting fear make his decisions for 3 years, calling it wisdom, calling it learning from experience. But really, he'd just been hiding. His phone rang while he was making coffee. Marcus. You sound different, Marcus said without preamble. Different how? Less miserable. Did you do something stupid or did you come to your senses? Daniel laughed, surprising himself. Maybe both. I think I need to talk to Emily. About time. What are you going to say? Daniel poured his coffee and walked to his window, looking out at the city in the bright morning light. That I was wrong. That I let fear make a decision my heart should have made. That she deserves better than someone who runs away when things get real. And that I love her. That I should have said that weeks ago instead of getting scared and pulling away. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's good, man. That's honest. Think it's enough? I think Emily's not the kind of person who needs grand gestures or perfect speeches. I think she needs to know that you're choosing her for real this time, not just when it's easy. After they hung up, Daniel spent the morning thinking about how to approach Emily. Should he call first, show up at her door, send flowers with an apology note? None of those felt right. Emily had always valued honesty over romance, directness over elaborate gestures. She'd want him to be real, not performative. He picked up his phone and typed a simple text. I know I don't have the right to ask, but could we talk? I owe you an honest conversation. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response came 20 minutes later. Okay, tomorrow evening, the park where we had our last conversation? Yes, thank you. Daniel spent the rest of Saturday and most of Sunday thinking about what he wanted to say. Not rehearsing a speech, but getting clear in his own mind about what was true and what mattered. By Sunday evening, as he walked toward the park where Emily was waiting, Daniel felt more nervous and more certain than he'd ever felt about anything in his life. Emily was sitting on the same bench where they had had their last conversation, the one where Daniel had chosen fear over possibility. She wore jeans and a soft green sweater that made her eyes look even more striking than usual. When she saw him approaching, she stood up. Not to leave, but to meet him as an equal. Daniel felt his heart race at the simple gesture of respect. Hi, he said. Hi. They started walking slowly along the path around the pond. The evening was warm and quiet, with just a few other people scattered around the park, couples holding hands, families with young children, an elderly man feeding ducks by the water. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Daniel said. Thank you for being honest about what you needed to talk about. Daniel nodded. Emily wasn't going to make this easy for him, but she also wasn't going to be cruel. She was just going to be herself, direct, fair, waiting to see what he had to say. I made a mistake, he said simply. A big one. Emily didn't respond, just kept walking beside him. When I told you we should take a break, that wasn't about you or about us or about whether what we had was real. That was about me being scared and letting that fear make my decisions for me. Scared of what? Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. Scared of loving you as much as I do. Scared of needing you the way I've started to need you. Scared of what it would mean if I let myself be completely happy with someone and then lost them. Emily's expression softened slightly, but she didn't say anything. My mother reminded me of my last serious relationship, how badly it ended, how hurt I was. And instead of remembering that you're nothing like Stephanie, that what we have is nothing like what I had with her, I let old pain convince me to run away from something beautiful. Daniel, let me finish, please, because I need you to understand this wasn't about you not being enough or us not being real. This was about me not being ready for something as good as what you were offering, about me choosing safety over courage, rules over love. They started walking again, slower this time. I've spent 3 years convincing myself that having rules about dating was smart, practical, that it was learning from experience. Daniel shook his head. But what I was really doing was limiting my life to only include things that felt safe. And you were never going to feel safe, Emily. Not because you're dangerous, but because loving you means risking everything. And now I think risking everything for the right person is exactly what love is supposed to be. They'd reached the pond where the ducks were swimming in lazy circles, just like the last time they'd been here together. But this time, instead of distance and disappointment, Daniel felt hope. "I love you," he said quietly. "I should have told you that weeks ago, but I was too scared to admit it to myself. I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see the best in people. I love how you challenged me to be braver than my fear, better than my rules. I love how completely myself I feel when I'm with you." Emily stopped walking and looked at him directly. "And if things get difficult? If we face challenges that your rules were designed to help you avoid?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "Then we face them together. We figure it out as we go. We choose each other every day, not just when it's easy." Emily was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the soft evening light. "I'm not interested in being someone's experiment in dating outside their comfort zone," she said finally. "You wouldn't be. And I'm not interested in being with someone who's going to run away every time his mother expresses concern or his friends raise questions. I understand that. And I can't promise I'll never be scared again, Emily. But I can promise I won't let fear make my decisions anymore. I can promise that if I'm scared, I'll talk to you about it instead of pulling away. What about your mother? Your concerns about repeating past patterns?" Daniel thought about his conversation with Linda, about her reminder that she'd raised him to face hard things, not run from them. "My mother wants me to be happy, and when I told her I thought I'd made a mistake, she reminded me that she raised me to be brave. As for past patterns, the only pattern I want to repeat is loving someone completely and being loved in return. Everything else we'll figure out as we go." Emily looked out at the pond, watching the ducks glide across the water in the fading light. "I missed you," she said quietly. Daniel felt something tight in his chest ease for the first time in a week. "I missed you too, more than I thought was possible. But Daniel, if we do this again, we do it honestly. No rules about who we're supposed to be or how this is supposed to work. Just us figuring out what love looks like when two people choose each other freely. That's all I want," Daniel said. "You and me, figuring it out together." When Emily stepped closer to him, when she reached up to touch his face gently, Daniel felt like he could breathe fully for the first time since he'd walked away from her. "I love you too," she said softly. "I was just waiting for you to be ready to hear it." When Daniel kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place he'd been looking for his whole life without knowing it existed. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in his mother's kitchen helping her prepare Sunday dinner. It had become their new tradition, him driving down every other weekend to spend time with her, something he realized he'd neglected in his years of focusing entirely on work and careful emotional management. "She's lovely, baby," Linda said, stirring the mac and cheese that Emily had specifically requested. "Really lovely." "She is," Daniel agreed, glancing through the kitchen window to where Emily was sitting on the back porch with photo albums spread around her, laughing at something Marcus was telling her about Daniel's college years. Teresa sat beside them, one hand on her growing belly, looking delighted to have another woman in their extended family circle. And she makes you happy, Linda continued. It wasn't a question. She does. Different than I've ever been happy before. Like, I'm more myself when I'm with her, not less. Linda nodded slowly. That's how it should be, you know. Love shouldn't ask you to be smaller. It should help you be more of who you really are. Daniel looked at his mother, surprised. I thought you were worried about me getting hurt again. I was, but then I met her, and I saw how she looks at you. Like you're exactly who she wants, not who she thinks you could become if you changed enough. Linda smiled. That's the kind of love worth taking risks for. I think so too. Good. Because she's staying for dinner, right? I made enough food for an army. Daniel laughed. She's staying. And she's bringing her father next time, if that's okay. More than okay. I'd like to meet the man who raised such a thoughtful daughter. Outside on the porch, Emily looked up as Daniel joined them, sliding into the chair beside her. She'd been looking at pictures of Daniel as a serious little boy, then a lanky teenager, then a college student with dreams bigger than his circumstances. Your mother's been telling me stories, Emily said, smiling up at him. Embarrassing ones, I hope, Marcus said. I was just getting to the part about his business plan to sell homemade cookies to pay for law school. I was 8, Daniel protested, and it was a good plan. It was adorable, Teresa said. You've always been someone who figures out how to make things work, haven't you? Daniel looked around at the people gathered on his mother's porch. Marcus, who'd known him longer than anyone. Teresa, who'd become the sister he'd never had. His mother, who'd raised him to be brave enough for love. And Emily, who'd seen through his rules to who he really was and loved that person completely. I've always tried, he said. But I think I've been figuring out the wrong things for a while. How to be safe instead of how to be happy. How to avoid pain instead of how to heal from it. Emily reached over and took his hand. And now? Now I'm figuring out how to love someone completely and let myself be loved in return. How to choose courage over fear, even when it's scary. How's that working out for you? Marcus asked with a grin. Daniel looked at Emily, at the way the afternoon light caught in her hair, at the gentle strength in her expression that had challenged him to be better from the very first moment they met. Better than I ever imagined possible, he said. 6 months later, Daniel and Emily stood in the same park where they had had their first difficult conversation, where he'd chosen fear and where he'd finally chosen love. But this time, they weren't alone. Jake and Lisa were there, along with Marcus and Teresa, who was now visibly pregnant and glowing. Rachel had driven in from her new job in the next city over. Thomas Carter stood beside Linda Brooks, the two parents who'd raised children strong enough to love each other well. I can't believe you're doing this here, Rachel said, wiping tears from her eyes as she watched Daniel get down on one knee in the grass beside the pond where ducks were swimming in their usual lazy circles. It's where everything changed, Emily said, looking down at Daniel with eyes full of joy and certainty. Where I finally convinced this stubborn man to be braver than his rules. Emily Carter, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest. You saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there. You challenged me to be better than my fear, more honest than my defenses. You taught me that love isn't about finding someone who fits your plans. It's about finding someone worth changing your plans for. He opened the small velvet box in his hands, revealing a simple, beautiful ring that caught the afternoon sunlight. Will you marry me? Will you keep figuring out what love looks like with me for the rest of our lives? Yes, Emily said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, absolutely yes. As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, as their family and friends cheered and applauded around them, Emily thought about rules and courage, and the difference between protecting yourself and limiting yourself. She thought about first meetings and gentle challenges, about fear overcome and love chosen freely, but mostly she thought about the future stretching out ahead of them, not perfect, not without challenges, but built on the foundation of two people who'd chosen to be brave enough for each other. When Daniel stood up and kissed her, it felt like the beginning of everything they'd been working toward since that first night, when she'd looked at him and seen not just who he was, but who he could become. I love you, he whispered against her lips. I love you too, she whispered back, rules and all. Daniel laughed, spinning her around in the golden afternoon light while their chosen family celebrated around them. "No more rules," he said as he set her down. "Just us figuring it out together." "Just us," Emily agreed and kissed him again. In the pond beside them, the ducks swam in peaceful circles, and the world felt full of endless beautiful possibility. 1 year later, Emily Brooks stood in the kitchen of the house she and Daniel had bought together, making breakfast for her husband of 3 months. The morning light streamed through the windows they'd chosen because they faced east, because Emily loved watching the sunrise, because Daniel had learned that making her happy made him happier than he'd ever thought possible. "Morning, Mrs. Brooks," Daniel said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she flipped pancakes at the stove. "Morning, Mr. Brooks. Sleep well?" "Always do when you're there." It was a small moment, ordinary in the way that the best moments of a good marriage are ordinary, but it represented something extraordinary. Two people who'd learned to choose love over fear, courage over safety, possibility over rules. On the refrigerator, held by magnets, were photos from their wedding day. Emily laughing as Daniel dipped her during their first dance. Linda and Thomas deep in conversation about their shared grandchildren hopes. Marcus and Teresa with their newborn son, who'd been born 2 weeks before the ceremony. There was also a photo from that first party they'd planned together, Jake's surprise birthday, where Lisa had captured them standing close together by the back fence, both of them trying to pretend they weren't falling in love. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, following her gaze to the photos. "Just remembering. That first night, when you told everyone about your dating rules. Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he considered all of Emily's questions. "Honestly? No. I was so sure I had everything figured out, so convinced that protecting myself was more important than opening myself up to something real. What changed? You did. The way you looked at me like I was worth more than my fears, like the man underneath all those rules was someone worth getting. To know." Emily turned in his arms to face him. He still is. Even when he occasionally forgets to load the dishwasher or leaves his socks on the bathroom floor? Even then, though we might need to revisit the sock situation. Daniel laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in their sunny kitchen. "I love you, Emily Brooks." "I love you too, Daniel Brooks, rules and all." "What rules?" Daniel asked, kissing her forehead. "I don't have rules anymore. I just have you." Outside their kitchen window, the world was waking up to another ordinary, extraordinary day. Neighbors walking their dogs, joggers starting their morning routes, delivery trucks bringing people the things they'd ordered online in hopes of making their lives a little better. But inside their house, Daniel and Emily had everything they needed, each other, and the courage to choose love every day, even when it was scary, even when it was hard, even when it required them to be braver than they'd ever imagined they could be. It was exactly what Emily had hoped for that first night, when she'd looked at a confident man with careful rules and seen the possibility of something beautiful. And it was more than Daniel had ever dared to dream, back when he thought protecting his heart was more important than opening it. Now they knew better. Now they knew that the best things in life, the things worth having, required you to be vulnerable, to take chances, to let your heart decide instead of your fear. It had taken them a while to learn that lesson, but it had been worth the wait. The end